In this week's episode of Bleach, the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, Yhwach awakens his true power, the Almighty, while Uryū deals Senjumaru a killing blow, allowing the Quincy's to make it all the way to Reio himself. And so, after a fairly long wait this time, we are back once again. We've crossed the halfway point of the story, and with episode 27 titled A, Part 3 of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc anime begins. Episode 26 ended on a cliffhanger, a somewhat abrupt and awkward cliffhanger, but a cliffhanger nonetheless. Yhwach's assault on the royal palace had seemingly ended in disaster, a crushing failure for the Wandenreich's forces, as the entirety of his Schutzstaffel were sealed away by Senjumaru's surprise Bankai, while the Quincy king himself was robbed of his power by Ichibei and sent hurtling back down to the sternritter. The showdown in the royal palace had been greatly expanded upon in the anime, and I think was overall considered a big success by the community. Taking up almost the entirety of the final 3 episodes of Part 2, the battle to decide the fate of the Soul King and of all the worlds of Bleach was exciting and eventful, at long last depicting in full the battle between the Zero Division and Yhwach's Schutzstaffel, something that was totally missing from the source material and was, going into the anime, one of the additions I personally most wanted to see. And now we find ourselves here at the foot of another set of 13 episodes to enjoy. In a dramatic twist of fate, Yhwach's true power suddenly returns to him, enabling him to turn the tables on Ichibei and the rest of Squad Zero, while setting his sights firmly on the Soul King himself. With all opposition at last removed, Yhwach begins enacting his ultimate goal, and I expect the narrative to dive even deeper into that next week. In regards to the overall presentation of the episode, for the most part, the character art in this first episode is fairly strong, if a little uneven in places. In particular, Yhwach himself really shines this week, and the introduction of the Almighty feels fittingly grandiose. The Almighty in particular always towed a dangerous line between feeling suitably eldritch and godly in appearance and falling all the way to completely goofy, but the way the episode chooses to present this power works really well and instills a sense of dread. Of course, from an artistic standpoint, the true winner of episode 27 is Ichibei and his final technique, Futen Taisatsuryō, with the anime bringing the mausoleum to life in a truly stunning fashion, complete with a fully musical incantation from the monk himself. Anyway, there's a fair bit to discuss, so as we begin our in-depth spoiler review and discussion of episode 27A, as always I'll be looking at this episode from the perspective of someone who has read the entirety of the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, meaning there will be potential spoilers for the entire story to follow, as we take a look at this episode to see what it added, what it changed, and what it took away from the source material. However, before we get started, if once you're done with the video you enjoyed it and you want to see more, you want to stay up to date with more videos coming from me and the channel, make sure to hit subscribe as well, as it really does help and I really do appreciate it so very much. Okay, as always, we'll begin with what the episode covered in terms of content from the source material, and I have to say that structurally this episode is a bit of a weird one. The episode starts with a hefty recap of roughly 9.5 minutes or so, but peculiarly the recap really only covers the very end of episode 26, with little to no prior context being included. Clearly the anime team thinks that's all you need to know. I didn't mind the recap on my first watch, but in hindsight it does feel somewhat unnecessary, especially considering it really does only cover the last half of the final episode of Part 2. Therefore it doesn't feel especially curated, and really is just replaying the back half of the last episode to you, which does feel somewhat redundant overall. That being said, the episode sneaks a brand new scene into the very middle of the recap, which does feel a little cheeky and seems designed to catch out those who aren't paying attention. But with the recap at the start and an entire pair of scenes occurring after the credits, this episode is left feeling a bit chopped up and a bit disjointed. And with the cliffhanger of episode 26 occurring almost 3/4 of the way through a chapter, well, we find this episode covers perhaps the fewest number of chapters in an episode yet, which isn't a bad thing. As a result, though, there isn't much that's been cut here, and instead there's a whole lot that's been added, which I suspect might become a trend moving through this core, and that's very exciting. So these were the chapters covered in episode 27. We have chapter 609A, the title of the episode, though only the final few pages of this particular chapter are actually covered here as new material. Chapter 610, Mausoleum of Skulls, and chapter 611, The Soul King Dies. I'd been saying since before part 2 arrived that chapter 611 would make for a great cliffhanger, and here we are, albeit not quite where I expected it to show up, but either way it still works really well as the ending of the episode. And yeah, with only 2 and a bit chapters covered, I think this might be the episode of the 1000-Year Blood War arc with the fewest number of chapters used, which is why, of the actual new content in the episode, roughly half of the screen time is devoted to brand new scenes not found in the original story. But all of these scenes work very well in my opinion. Even if it's not the case, there's definitely a sense that at least some of what we see in this episode was actually meant to appear in episode 26, and so with the end of episode 27 it feels like we've finally finished playing catch up to some degree, and I expect the story to begin feeling truly new and fresh with episode 28 next week. Before we get started on the spoiler analysis, in case you missed it, I recently released a video dedicated entirely to discussing Uryū's apparent Quincy Vollständig that appears in this episode. I'll still be talking about it here in some detail, but for a more thorough breakdown, consider checking that video out if you haven't already. So, as mentioned already, the episode begins with a sizable recap. Some viewers have pointed out that the recap is roughly 9 minutes long, coinciding with Yhwach's recurring motif surrounding the number 9 that features prominently in the Kaiser Gesang, almost as if the 9 minutes of recap are the final 9 minutes, counting down to the awakening of the Almighty in real time, which, if intentional, is a very cool Easter egg, and to be honest, almost forgives the existence of the recap in the first place. Like I mentioned earlier, however, if you skip the recap, you'll actually miss a totally new scene, as it's dropped right in the middle here. As Senjumaru's Bankai is activated, shaking the very worlds of Bleach themselves, we cut to Ichigo and his friends as they continue to head towards the palace. Ichigo notices Senjumaru's Reiatsu, and Yoruichi is the one to speculate that the Zero Division member is using her Bankai. Ganju can't believe this spiritual pressure is coming from a single person. By the way, it's in times like this that I really miss the original spiritual pressure effect in the anime, and I think its absence is noticeable. Anyway, Orihime asks Ichigo if he's talking about Squad Zero, to which Ichigo remembers that his friends haven't ever met them in person, and he helps them to get caught up regarding this mysterious divine division. Ichigo explains that his new Zanpakuto, his clothes, and even his new powers are all a result of his training with the Zero Division. Honestly, when he puts it like that, it's clear to see the incredible impact that the Zero Division had in really such a short time. He then echoes Hikafune's own words when he says that everything Squad Zero does is on a totally different level from the rest of the Soul Society. But I like this a lot. Not only does it make sense for the gang to share information with one another, but I appreciate the anime's continued commitment to wiping out any loose ends, or even any perceived loose ends, that is. Even if it's something as small as Ichigo's friends having never met the Zero Division, at the very least Ichigo is detailing to them what he's been up to, and that's awesome. Naively, however, both Orihime and Ganju wonder that if the Zero Division is that powerful, then they can probably defeat the Quincy's, with Ganju doubling down on the idea that if Squad Zero kills Yhwach before they arrive, they will then be home free. Ichigo's reaction is very interesting. He agrees with a soft smile, but his expression falls afterwards. Perhaps due to the fact that he's had an altercation with Yhwach already, he doesn't believe, or he knows in his heart, that it won't be that simple, and he's not quite ready to get his hopes up just yet. Or, on the flip side, maybe he was hoping to fight Yhwach, especially after learning the truth regarding his mother, though that feels a little unlikely to me. Perhaps he's worried for Uryū's sake. Either way, there is more going on here than meets the eye. But that's it for the new scene. We then return to the rest of the recap, which carries on through to the end of episode 26. As Yhwach plummets from the royal palace covered in black, and with his name changed to Black Ant, he suddenly cries out, exclaiming that he never imagined that he could see this much with his eyes closed. I've always took this to mean he never believed he would get this far without the Almighty, and suddenly his irises split into two per eye. The very moment this happens, the moment his true power awakens, we're treated to a new scene where Senjumaru's Bankai begins to glow with a brilliant blue light, the individual Tan Mono holding the Schutzstaffel prisoner seemingly melting away. Behind Ichibei, a twisting torrent of blue energy comes bursting out of the ground in a pillar of light. Turning on the spot, Ichibei suddenly coughs up blood as he's stabbed through the chest by a glittering sword. As Ichibei clasps the sword in his hands, he sees Yhwach standing before him, still coated in black. And yet, slowly but surely, the name Black Ant begins to disappear, the white characters crumbling away from Yhwach's form. Let's talk about this sequence for a moment, because it has always confused me a little bit. We know that Yhwach didn't have access to the Almighty prior to this moment, and that's reinforced further in the anime, where in episode 24, we see the Almighty is sealed when Yhwach captures the left arm of the Soul King. And yet, it is a little bit weird that Yhwach seemingly accurately predicts and foresees just where Ichibei will die before the Almighty has awakened. So, considering Ichibei robs Yhwach of his power and renames him prior to the Almighty returning, shouldn't its return therefore be impossible? The white characters fading away in the manner they do implies that Yhwach has used the Almighty in the very moment his eyes awoke to see into the future and alter it, removing his false name and restoring his strength. And the anime confirms this when the screen flashes very quickly with that negative tone they're using to dictate when the Almighty has been activated. But how can he use the Almighty at all with his power gone and his entire being covered in black ink? Unless the Almighty being something inherent to Yhwach means it bypasses everything else and just passively activates inside him, but that also can't be true. As Hashwolf explains later, Yhwach could have technically opened his eyes at any point, but chose not to for the sake of the rest of the Quincy's. So, when he opens his eyes as he falls, he is actively choosing to do so himself. He's choosing to use that power, but all power resides in names, and without the name Yhwach, how can he do this? I know I'm overthinking it, but it is fun to discuss. Let me know in the comments if you have any insight into how this is working. Could it be due to the fact that he named himself Yhwach in the beginning anyway, and so therefore he was the one who gave himself whatever power resides in that name? Or could it be the fact that because he gave himself that name, the name Yhwach doesn't hold any power at all, the Almighty is inherently his regardless? Could it be the fact that the Almighty is a power stemming from the Soul King, and therefore it supersedes anything Ichibei can do? Anyway, the next sequence is adapted fairly faithfully from the source material, save for one major aspect: Hashwolf and his overall involvement. Let's take a look at the anime's version first. As Ichibei wonders how Yhwach is still alive, we move back to Senjumaru's Bankai. Hashwolf is released from his prison as a seething blue flame, much like the one used in Wako Mundo, burns away his Tan Mono. But what's interesting about this is that while we know the Tan Mono prisons themselves are breaking down, that's not where Hashwolf eventually escapes from. He's still trapped within Senjumaru's Bankai for the time being. Hashwolf is still imprisoned within that room full of fire that we saw him in episode 26. However, the actual fire used to consume Hashwolf and imprison him has now been extinguished. We see it disappear. To look at a slightly more obvious example, let's take Askin. We know from episode 26 that Askin was crushed within spiked sheets of metal, thus sealing him and generating his Tan Mono, almost like a gravestone essentially. Based on what's happening to Hashwolf here, we can surmise that at the same time, Askin has freed himself from those metal sheets, but still remains within that personal realm of Shatatsu Karagara Shigarami no Suji until Senjumaru herself is dead. Only after that moment, I think, can Askin escape his own actual room. Anyway, Hashwolf's monologue about the Almighty itself is mostly the same, albeit shortened somewhat. In the source material, chapter 609 ends with Hashwolf introducing the power and giving it its name, and then chapter 610 continues his speech, but here it's essentially been mashed into one moment, with the end of chapter 609 pushed back to the end of the explanation as a whole. The other major difference, though, is that the circumstances are totally changed from the source material regarding the Schutzstaffel in general. When Yhwach's power returns in the manga, Hashwolf and Uryū are simply standing together on the edge of the Royal Palace walkway, as presumably the Schutzstaffel decimate the rest of the Zero Division somewhere behind them. And so Hashwolf is just kind of casually explaining all of this to Uryū. Here, though, of course, Hashwolf is isolated and alone within Senjumaru's Bankai, so who is he talking to? It's possible he's still talking to the apparition of Senjumaru who trapped him before, but I'm not sure how that works in regards to Uryū clearly taking all of the attention of the real Senjumaru herself. Anyway, the anime gives us a nice little new moment where Ichibei continuously tries to strike Yhwach, only for Yhwach to evade him every single time thanks to the Almighty. Oh, and there's a cool detail to be found too. Each time we cut back to Hashwolf here, more of the background has been torched away by this blue flame until eventually the entire room is ablaze. We're then treated to the fantastic shot of Yhwach from the cliffhanger of chapter 609 as he announces his power as the Almighty before Ichibei. We then find ourselves in another completely new scene as Uryū is freed from his prison. As Uryū falls, a ring of blue light emanates from around his heart. And this isn't the last time that Uryū's heart will be aflame with power in this episode either. As we know, there is a connection between Quincy's heart and Yhwach himself. Yhwach's blood flows through every Quincy, so they are all intimately connected to him, but this also acts as the catalyst for each Quincy's eventual downfall too, as when Yhwach uses the Alsvalen on Quincy's, it forms a blood clot in their heart, causing them to die. And yet, there's something weird going on here. Hashwolf, as we mentioned a moment ago, is clearly still imprisoned within his personal room, but Uryū has been freed completely, landing in front of the real Senjumaru herself at the foot of her giant loom. Maybe Uryū was just freed first, I'm not sure, but either way, he now has the chance to save the rest of the Schutzstaffel. Senjumaru wonders aloud whether Yhwach's awakening caused Uryū to develop new powers, and I have to wonder how accurate she is. It feels like this speculation of hers is probably supposed to be the truth for our sake, but what new powers has Uryū gained exactly? Well, again, we talk a lot about that in my last video, but we'll discuss it briefly here too. For as Senjumaru says this, Uryū's eyes turn a blood red, blute pulsing around them. At the very moment this happens, Yhwach notices Uryū's new power and seems to grow suspicious. So here's what I think is happening, and this is actually an updated theory that I didn't discuss in that other video. It's clear to me that Uryū definitely has a portion of the Almighty now. Senjumaru mentions new powers, and then we see the red eyes immediately afterwards, implying she's correct. But also, this is probably how Uryū escaped his prison completely, whereas Yhwach can't yet, because he doesn't have the Almighty at the moment. And of course, Yhwach noticing that something is going on with Uryū is the cherry on top that all but confirms it. But Senjumaru tells Uryū that if he can't sleep, she'll help him by sewing his eyes shut. And I think this notion of him sleeping is literal, by the way. It looks like Senjumaru's Bankai entraps its enemies in a state of suspended animation, which is why Uryū kind of topples out of it when he's free, implying as well that him breaking free was more of a subconscious thing. Also, Senjumaru continues to have some of the coolest, coldest lines in the series. But Uryū isn't having it and he fires an arrow at Senjumaru. Senjumaru disappears into her fabrics and we see her circling the Quincy, her image appearing on each Tanmono, proving, by the way, that her powers aren't limited to only working inside the individual rooms. Even within the main central component of her Bankai, she can still use these powers freely. Every Tanmono here is still available for her to do with as she wants. Uryū flees as Senjumaru sends strands of his own personal prison Tanmono after him, conjuring imagery of Uryū attempting to escape his fate. Gathering reishi beneath his feet, Uryū darts through the air, skating across the sky in order to evade her. Twisting back around, Uryū turns and bolts towards the ground, where the real Senjumaru is waiting like a spider in the center of her web, the Tanmono gathering around her before launching upwards. Using Licht Regen, Uryū deflects the fabrics before landing on the ground behind Senjumaru, preparing an arrow to blast through her. All of this, by the way, is a lovely piece of choreography and is animated nice and fluidly. In an instant, however, before he can fire off his arrow, the floor beneath his feet becomes lava, causing Uryū to leap away into the air. A stray droplet of lava catches him on the cheek, but his blute instantly defends him against it, implying that he's kind of running blute vein all the time, I think. Senjumaru asks Uryū if he's feeling something stirring within his veins, before commenting that it's the blue blood he's inherited from Yhwach. Blue blood on the surface might simply mean Quincy blood, but interestingly, blue blood is a phrase often used in association with royalty, meaning that Senjumaru might be insinuating that Uryū has inherited royal blood from Yhwach, the Soul King's blood, perhaps. Senjumaru then wonders what there is for a mere Quincy to inherit anyway, and what legacy can one forsaken by the Soul King leave. This is obviously a pretty fascinating line, while also betraying Senjumaru's true prejudice against the Quincy. Why are the Quincy forsaken, in her words, by the Soul King, and what does she mean by that? In reality, the Soul King is perhaps closer to a Quincy than anything else, and he hates the Shinigami for what they did to him, so either Senjumaru is totally ignorant to the true standing of the Quincy in the world, or there is something else going on here. Something that might be explained in a flashback, maybe? It could simply be that the Shinigami inherited the Soul Society and effectively became gods, while also destroying the Quincy race on several occasions. Senjumaru then tries to engulf Uryū in the flames of her Bankai once again before raining shards of ice down upon him, revealing that within the confines of her Bankai, she really can do just about anything she likes. But Senjumaru isn't done berating Uryū and the Quincy just yet. Quite literally looking down her nose at him, Senjumaru says that the Quincy have outlived their time, and that she will eradicate their bloodline here and now. Aside from this being obviously racist and elitist against the Quincy, it sounds to me like Senjumaru believed they should have all been killed a millennium ago and that their time has ended. While Senjumaru's entire appearance and demeanour has an aristocratic and almost old-fashioned feel to it, I wouldn't be surprised if much of the ancient Shinigami upper echelon held similar views to this. This is exactly the kind of response that Masaki was terrified of getting when she told Isshin that she was a Quincy after all. Senjumaru then conjures a new fabric pattern which spawns hollows, the creatures falling towards Uryū. Again, this is pretty callous. Senjumaru knows that Quincy have no resistance to Hollow Reiatsu, so she really is trying to put Uryū down once and for all. Also, how does her Bankai actually spawn hollows? Are they illusory, or has she been trapping hollows within her Bankai for years, perhaps? Well, we potentially have an answer to that too, for as Uryū destroys one of the hollows, he is shocked to see that its body was filled with fabric, almost as though it was holding the hollow together. That fabric then wraps itself around Uryū's leg, and as he prepares to blast it, Senjumaru summons even more hollows to descend upon him. We get a nice bit of animation here as Uryū shoots the hollows above him, but is dragged downwards rapidly by the fabric around his leg. As he kind of swings like a pendulum through the arena, he manages to sever the fabric with an arrow, but crash lands heavily on the pile of hollows beneath him regardless, unable to correct himself in time. Now completely bound by the fabric, Uryū is caught, and Senjumaru uses the Tanmono to lift Uryū from the ground, dangling him helplessly in front of her by his arms. Senjumaru approaches Uryū and tells him not to worry, for she isn't Mayuri, and tinkering with corpses isn't really her thing. A nice little callback to the fact that she and Mayuri do have some history together, but also to the fact that Uryū and Mayuri have history together too, making Uryū and Senjumaru's new battle all the more meaningful. Senjumaru then lifts Shigarami to Uryū's neck, telling him that he wouldn't have died needlessly had he just stayed hidden in the world of the living, to which Uryū replies that he has a reason to fight. While it's impossible to know for sure, I assume he's talking about his true motive for being there. But Senjumaru doesn't care, nor does she even seem to listen, telling him that what she's going to do next will only hurt a bit. Driving Shigarami's needle into the back of Uryū's neck, Senjumaru has seemingly won. But in that moment, Uryū's eyes widen as a droplet of blood splashes on a blank white background. As I mentioned in my last video, I think this droplet of blood is a reference to Yhwach's holy blood that Uryū drank in order to become a sternritter, and here, his true power, the power that was granted to him during that ritual, is finally waking up. Uryū suddenly glows a powerful, gleaming, angelic light as we cut away from their battle once more. With that, we return to the source material again, finding ourselves in chapter 610. In the original chapter, it was Yhwach who went on to explain the Almighty in detail, but as Haschwalth has already done so, the explanation isn't recycled again. Instead, Yhwach tells Ichibei that he's going to lose, but Ichibei refutes it, and I love that they kept in Ichibei's almost crazed expression as he can scarcely believe Yhwach's hubris. Wondering how Yhwach plans to defeat him while covered in so much black, Ichibei gathers that darkness to him, creating a towering column of black in the centre of the battleground. It's here that we finally get to see Ichibei's ultimate trump card, his last resort, Futen Taisatsuryō, and one of the coolest looking abilities in Bleach. Except here, In the anime, while the incantation is exactly the same as in the source material, the actual ritual process is fully drawn out, giving Ichibei an entire sequence to himself as he both sings and dances, chanting the ritual to activate his ability. Artistically, this scene feels completely different to the version in the manga, even though they're ostensibly the exact same. But here in the anime, Ichibei gathering all the black to him has coated the world in a bleak shade of grey. Another nice detail is that Yhwach's feet are being held to the ground by black ink, though of course he could still escape if he wanted to, but he chooses to let Ichibei do his thing, which is very thoughtful of him. Ichibei conjuring the dish out of darkness in his outstretched hand looks extremely cool in the anime, and there's something very otherworldly about his incantation and ritual process. Eventually he brings his hands together in prayer before his face, completing the incantation by promising Yhwach that he'll never be born again. A nod, of course, to the true power of Futen Taisatsuryō before darkness crawls across his face, plunging the fighters and the battlefield into the murky, inky reality of Ichibei's power. The entire elaborate process of Futen Taisatsuryō actually being constructed is new for the anime, as we see graves bursting out of the ground around Ichibei before a stream of skulls barrels towards Yhwach. The camera angle here is very cool and very engaging, showing the skulls rushing towards the Quincy King before it then pulls back dramatically, racing towards Ichibei and beyond him as the mausoleum comes into view. Interestingly, in the original chapter, Ichibei's prayer beads seem to float upwards and remain hanging in the air above him, but in the anime they quickly settle back down again as though they were just being blustered by the wind. I mentioned this before when watching the teasers for this part, but the overall look of this power in the anime is nothing short of exceptional. It's an extremely cool visual. Everything looks like a black and grey watercolour painting, and both characters are outlined in a striking blood red. The very air around them is thick with a constant flow of wispy debris, and it all looks amazing. Ichibei then reveals Yhwach's fate to him. These graves that now surround them are dedicated to the Quincy King and were built by stealing 100 knights from Soul Society's future. That's an awful lot of black. Futen Taisatsuryō is an interesting example, and perhaps even a hypocritical example, of where the character explaining their power actually kind of works, in my opinion, for I'd have been thoroughly annoyed had Ichibei died and we were left with zero idea about what this majestic thing can actually do, but thankfully Ichibei spells it all out for us. The graves will soak up all of the black Yhwach is wearing, but also it will turn his blood, his bones, and his flesh black as well, and then return them to nothingness. But not to the cycle of rebirth. Ichibei tells Yhwach that rebirth won't be permitted, meaning Futen Taisatsuryō takes an individual and quite literally grounds them into nothingness, removing them from existence entirely. It's cool to think as well that it requires such incredible power and creation to defy the cycle completely like this. Ichibei needed to steal 100 knights from the Soul Society in order to make it work. But of course, it doesn't work. In a scene taken again straight from the original chapter, Ichibei and Yhwach fall into a pitch-black hell at the exact same time, causing Ichibei to realise in horror that yes, Yhwach can indeed see the future and has already decided the outcome. Yhwach reminds the shocked Ichibei that he already told him that he can see all, and as a third iris comes into being upon his eye, the Quincy King proudly announces himself as Yhwach. In a new shot, Ichibei leaps desperately towards Yhwach, his blade outstretched. Perhaps this is how Futen Taisatsuryō is finalised. If Ichibei succeeds in stabbing Yhwach, will the mausoleum entomb him forever, perhaps? Alas, we'll never know. As Ichibei reaches Yhwach, the Quincy King opens his hand and obliterates the leader of the Zero Division, his body rupturing and exploding into pieces. The end of chapter 610. Just watching this scene, it is crazy to think how far we've come. Back in the day, the anime heavily censored almost every major injury inflicted upon a hero character to an almost comical degree. Now, in full view of us, Ichibei's severed head lands with a thud on a puddle of blood. While gore isn't everything, and should never be, there's no denying that the events of the Thousand Year Blood War arc would lose a lot of their bite were it to be censored in such a way. After all, this is the final arc, and the villains are about to win. It needs to be bad for our heroes, and the visceral nature of the violence on show is a great way of really hammering that home. But before we can continue, we return to Uryū's battle against Senjumaru. Again, I'll direct you to my last video if you haven't seen it yet, as there we go into detail about Uryū's new Quincy Vollständig. But as a nearly uncontrollable power erupts from his heart once more, it forms two gigantic glittering wings behind him. Uryū now flying in the skies above Senjumaru. As he manages to stabilize his power, Senjumaru wonders if Uryū's lost his mind. He's still ensnared by her Bankai after all. However, Uryū interrupts her, revealing that she is the one trapped by Shatatsu Karagara Shigarami no Tsuji, horrifying the Shinigami. It definitely seems likely that this is another showcase of the antithesis' frankly monstrous power, as Uryū casually swaps situations with Senjumaru, just like that. I am so glad the antithesis is actually getting more screen time. It's absurd to think that in the original story, it's only ever used once. I definitely think that Uryū's battle with Hashwolf is going to be changed in a big way in Core 4. It seems likely that he will have a fully developed Vollständig by then, but also I'm keen to see how things change for Hashwolf too. And then of course, there's the very final battle. Maybe we'll actually see how Uryū's power can overcome the Almighty itself. With Senjumaru unable to escape, cocooned by her own Bankai, Uryū lifts a shimmering arrow. In another callback to his original feud with Mayuri, Uryū tells Senjumaru that on his honor as a Quincy, he will kill her, before firing the arrow. In a moment that still feels unreal to me, Uryū follows through with his threat. He snipes Senjumaru right through the heart, the Zero Division member's eyes wide in a blank shock. Again, I want to reiterate, though, that this feels right, however weird that sounds. With Uryū flat out murdering a Shinigami on screen, it does feel like a character arc of sorts has been fulfilled. One that was abandoned many years ago when Uryū himself diverged from it. Now, him being with the Wandenreich has allowed that notion to return. And of course, Uryū killing a Shinigami, especially a Shinigami as prominent in the lore as Senjumaru, feels like the ultimate apex, the ultimate endpoint of what potential there was regarding a storyline where Uryū joins the villains. Many people wanted Uryū to face off against Mayuri in the Thousand Year Blood War arc, and to maybe even kill him, but this is absolutely the next best thing. And hey, based on the last trailer, maybe that will still happen. I still don't know what Uryū is doing in this shot, for example. But the anime seems to realise that too, hence they're emphasising Senjumaru's connection to the mad scientist, but also her vicious hatred of the Quincy. I highlighted this in my last video too, but relatively recently I made a video looking at how the anime was fixing Uryū, and how having him kill Senjumaru would only further cement his conviction, and well, they've done it. The source material really struggled with Uryū in this arc in a huge way. It never made his turn to the dark side even remotely convincing. But if I was an anime-only viewer right now and I saw this moment, I would certainly be wondering if he's now too far gone at this point. Already Uryū has had so much more to do in this arc than he did in the manga, and I love it. I'm all for it. He's actually being used to his fullest potential right now, and we'll see if the series can keep this momentum up in the future as well. But Senjumaru dies as blood runs from the hole in her chest and her Bankai crumbles around her. I do have to wonder though, how does Uryū actually get away with this? Even if he does help the heroes defeat Yhwach in the end, I feel like murdering a member of the Zero Division is a pretty enormous transgression. Prior to part 3, a part of me did wonder if Senjumaru might somehow become privy to Uryū's true motive, but no, he just straight up kills her. I'm sure he'll get off the hook in the end somehow, but it feels like a hugely consequential crime in this moment. Anyway, as the last remaining member of the Zero Division dies and her Bankai comes undone, the effect is felt reverberating throughout the Seirete. Ichigo, Urahara, Ukitake, and Mayuri are shocked, but whether they can tell it was Uryū or not, I'm not sure. By the way, I think Ukitake is meant to be healing his Sagi here, but it doesn't really look like him, and his tattoos are missing as well. Also, this is the first time we've seen Ukitake since the end of episode 25, where he revealed the Kamikake. Uryū struggles to contain his power once again, but succeeds in subduing it, though his eyes flash red once more momentarily. As Uryū clenches his fist, blue vein appears on his hand once again, though this time, as I mentioned in my last video, it does look as though it takes on the appearance of an eye very briefly. Could this be a hint towards Uryū now housing some of the Soul King's power? As the Bankai dissipates around them, Uryū waits as the other members of the Schutzstaffel arrive. At long last, Yhwach's proclamation from chapter 543 has finally been made good on. Other sternritter have at last witnessed Uryū's power for themselves in a way that really works. Hashwolf, of course, doesn't look particularly pleased about it, but the elite Quincy gather together, waiting for their master's next move. Returning again to the source material with chapter 611, Yhwach comments that he foresaw that Ichibei would die 3 steps short of the designated area he drew out at the start of their battle back in episode 25, before placing his hand upon Ichibei's seal and shattering it with a massive burst of energy. I like the little detail that Ichibei's head is actually quite far away from his feet. I always thought his body parts were a little closer together than that in the original chapter. As he advances to the palace with his children, Yhwach notes that Squad Zero has fallen. Again, I just want to reiterate as plainly as I can that back in the day, this moment sucked. After having their entire fight off-screen, Yhwach mentioned that Squad Zero had fallen, and all we saw was their defeated corpses. At least here, they've been given a proper fight, and I'm grateful for it. Here in the anime, we see the Blood Oath seal once again. Senjumaru's candle at last burns out. There's a cool detail here too. Senjumaru's insignia on the seal has been ferociously burned away. At first I thought this was because she was killed by Uryū after the Blood Oath seal had been released, but actually I don't think that's the case. Instead, I think it symbolises that she was the one to go into overdrive, so to speak, and her respective flame burned very brightly, increased massively with the release of her true power, incinerating her section of the seal. The shot of Ichibei's severed head is really grisly, but very effective too, in showcasing their complete and utter failure. Up next, though, is perhaps the coolest, most unexpected new addition to the episode. As the Schutzstaffel line up on either side of Yhwach, Hashwolf declares that their 1,000 years of prayer are about to be rewarded at last. Again, this line is spoken in the manga, but not here. He says it to Uryū at the start of chapter 610, while explaining how the Almighty works. As the Schutzstaffel kneel before him, Yhwach approaches the edge of the walkway, the palace in his sights. Now, in the original chapter, we never see how he actually reaches the palace, though he does give a maniacal grin, which I do kind of miss. There's a sense of complete elation in this shot that feels like he's almost amazed he's managed to do this. However, what we get here in the anime is even better. As Yhwach reaches the edge of the walkway, teetering on the abyss itself, he suddenly begins pulling the entire landing platform apart behind him. Using his all-powerful dominion over Reishi, Yhwach strips the nearby pillars bare and uses that Reishi to begin creating a shimmering, heavenly staircase beneath his feet. But this moment is very similar in execution to when he made his way to Haribel's cell in episode 2, when he broke down his own throne to build a staircase. But here, though, it's on a completely colossal scale. We're treated to this wonderful shot that encircles Yhwach and the landing platform from afar, showing the true scope of his power and control as he rips the walkway apart, using it piece by piece to build this grand astral staircase that leads towards the palace. And so Yhwach begins to climb the stairs to the palace, the brilliant sun gleaming behind the fortress, and it feels as though Yhwach is entering heaven itself. As he climbs, Yhwach thinks back to the many injustices the Quincy have suffered over the course of their 1,000-year crusade. His meeting with Ichibei, where the Shinigami insulted them and revealed the truth behind the endless agony and humiliation of the Soul King before Ichibei even went as far as to try and kill him. Yhwach thinks back to his attack on the Gotei 13 in an attempt to crush what he calls the root cause of their pain. By the way, side note, but interestingly, earlier in the episode, the anime team used the new shot of Ichibei activating Bankai from the Blu-ray release, and they've done so again here, showing Yhwach with his shorter beard from 1,000 years ago that looks more akin to Zangetsu, though they couldn't fix his long hair apparently. As Yhwach reaches the top of the stairs, there is an air of finality to this moment, and he comments that their tireless journey and all of the events that have permeated it every step of the way will be consummated by the death of Reio himself. Stepping up into the Soul King's throne room and facing down his crystallized father, Yhwach says that his footsteps are the bells that toll for the king of the three worlds. Again, Yhwach harboring that anger at what the current state of the Soul King represents, the splitting of the worlds and the introduction of the cycle of rebirth. While the episode technically ends here, in fact we get a substantial scene after the credits too. Continuing with chapter 611, Ichigo and his friends at last arrive in the royal palace. In keeping with how the 1,000-Year Blood War arc's anime adaptation has been so far, the comedic scene of Ganju crashing out of the pillar is removed here. Ichigo and the others look around and immediately discover Ichibei's remains. And speaking of which, what happened to the corpses of Oetsu, Hikifune and Tenjiro? Unless they were lost when Yhwach stripped much of the landing space away, shouldn't they be sat there in pools of blood? That's probably an equally grim visual. Either way, I like that they kept in Orihime's horrified reaction. It feels very real, and despite arriving in the royal palace amidst the biggest war they've ever known, the sight of such unfettered violence is upsetting to her, but also to all of them as well. Even so, Orihime rushes to Ichibei's side in an effort to save him. Meanwhile, however, Ichigo hears Ichibei's voice calling out to him on the air, asking him to recite his name. And when Ichigo does, Ichibei's eyes spring open and his body begins to shift. The blood around him is drawn back inside of him, turning to pure black, almost like oil, and his disembodied head rises up atop a bubbling plume of black before restoring him entirely. It's honestly a really cool little sequence and something that was missing from the original chapter. How it works, I'm still not entirely sure. Ichibei notes that all power resides in names, and by having Ichigo specifically say it, Ichibei was able to borrow some of Ichigo's boundless strength. But does this mean Ichibei's body is made entirely of black, or what? Anyway, again in a scene from chapter 611, the revived Ichibei tells Ichigo and the others that although his body has returned, his strength hasn't. Therefore, he pleads with Ichigo to stop Yhwach. He doesn't have to kill him, but if he's able to stop him, he must. Ichibei explains that the Soul King is the linchpin of all three worlds. The world of the living, the Soul Society, and Waco Mundo will all fall if Reio is killed. Ichigo, Orihime, Chad, Yoruichi, and Ganju then all rush forwards, preparing to head to the palace themselves. Again, how they get there is never revealed, but I mean, based on the anime, presumably Yhwach left his staircase there. Meanwhile, we get a new, frankly, very surprising scene. Kyoraku arrives in the darkness of Muken at the foot of a very familiar crucifix. Towering above him is none other than the imprisoned Aizen, bound and impaled to the slab by glowing red bars of light. Interestingly, Aizen's face is fully covered here. This is how his face appears on the chapter cover of 617, I think it is, where he's first reintroduced, but of course his face wasn't covered when he spoke with Yhwach in episode 6. So, what's going on? Could his unbound face in that episode have simply been an illusion? Regardless, it is so funny to me how desperate the anime is to continually return to Aizen. They keep showing him again and again, while to be honest, I applaud Kubo's restraint in that regard. Also, I do wonder how Aizen's introductory scene will play out. Like I said, this isn't in the manga, but crucially it's not how Kyoraku meets Aizen either. Kyoraku waits at the edge of complete, crushing darkness, noting that the innocent can go no further into the abyss until Aizen himself steps out of it. Honestly, I always thought that whole setup was completely badass, so I really hope they've retained it in some form. Meanwhile, Ichibei too is left looking rather ominous as Ichigo and the others race up the stairs towards the throne room. Actually, thinking about it, presumably they don't use Yhwach's handy staircase, since that staircase took Yhwach right into the throne room itself, I think. Either way, it really doesn't matter, for they're too late. Yhwach approaches the Soul King, his face reflected upon the crystal in what may or may not be an awesome piece of foreshadowing. Lifting his blade to the king, this time his actual sword as opposed to his reishi broadsword, Yhwach stabs his father through the chest, the crystal instantly turning a deep shade of red. As the sword is plunged into Reio's unmoving form, Yhwach notes that the Soul King is his father, the one who has seen the future. This is obviously a huge moment, and I do think it was done justice here. We'll see next week how the anime chooses to continue to portray all of this, but I'm optimistic, especially with what comes next. As the episode draws to a close, we see the title, A, before the poem appears, and to be honest, this might be the most exciting moment for me in the entire thing. In perhaps the episode's biggest twist, for me at least, the poem for next week's episode comes courtesy of Yhwach himself, but not the Yhwach you might expect. Instead, the image showcases what looks to be a very young Yhwach with a single tear running down his face. I don't think I need to tell you that this isn't something we have ever seen before. This Yhwach is younger even than his form from 1,000 years ago, making me wonder if it's perhaps the version that looks like Tensa Zangetsu, or could it be even younger than that? And with tears running down his face, what exactly is going on here? It's almost something to do with his father. We'll talk about that in a moment. For now, the poem reads, "The bell will continue to toll until you fall to the earth, struck by the sword." There's potentially a lot of meaning in this poem for what we could see next week, but for now, let's move on. Right, well, that's it for episode 27. I have no idea how we've been going as long as we have, but before we move on to our predictions for next time, it is time once again for Sternritter in Memoriam. Except no Sternritter died this week. In fact, multiple Sternritter were resurrected, meaning we can move right on past it. Now, I don't want to go too crazy with predictions this week because I feel like I know what I want to see. But as I'm sure you can tell, I am very excited. The main point of contention for me is a possible flashback featuring a very young Yhwach and hopefully the Soul King himself. I've said it before, but what I'd really love to see is Reio before he becomes what we know him to be. I want to see him as an actual character. I want to see him move, I want to see him talk. As it was mentioned before, it seems like we're going to learn his name, so perhaps that will be in the next episode too. And if we're already getting a flashback for the Soul King, well, now does seem to be the right time. But in regards to the poem for next week, well, I can't help but wonder if it maybe means a couple of things. On the surface, it seems like it might just be hinting at what happens next week, where Ichigo eventually kills Reio properly using Yhwach's sword, and that could be what it means by until you fall to the earth struck by the sword. But actually, a part of me wonders if it is a little less obvious than that, and if it's all in reference to the Soul King being split apart by none other than the Shinken Hakyoken, as so many of us have theorized in the past. The Shinken Hakyoken has the ability to separate the power of God by reflecting its light back at him, and the Soul King is the closest thing to an actual god in the universe of Bleach. What better way? What greater opportunity to actually foreshadow the Shinken Hakyoken than this? And the poem specifically mentions until you fall to the earth. And if we're to take that literally, it again means when the Soul King's body parts are separated and rained down from the heavens. We have a vague image in our heads now, thanks to Ichigo's journey on Irazu Sandor, of what happened to the Soul King in a sense. But to actually see it laid out clearly before us would be something else entirely. Until you fall to the earth, struck by the sword. I mean, that feels so clearly like a reference to the Shinken Hakyoken to me, resulting in Reio's body parts scattering and some indeed falling to earth. That being said, we know the entire episode won't be dedicated to a flashback, sadly. Ichigo will face off against Yhwach, and with the episode being called Kill the King, it seems likely that it will run until at least the end of chapter 614, though possibly a little further than that. It also feels like next week is possibly too early for Ichigo versus Uryū. They don't actually confront each other in the throne room until chapter 619. So I think this whole showdown with Yhwach and his men in the throne room could maybe last 3 episodes total, especially accounting for additional new content. So, in episode 28, I hope we are getting a substantial flashback for the Soul King. I'd love for it to be the length of the flashback at the start of episode 24, to be totally honest. Then I think we're getting chapters 612, 613, and 614 at least. 613 was actually a very short chapter due to Kubo's illness at the time, if I remember rightly, so they could potentially squeeze more in, but we know from the trailers that Ichigo's battle with Yhwach is being extended, with Ichigo possibly using Getsuga Jujisho for a second time too. Either way, I am extremely excited for this Saturday. Let it be known now that if we do in fact get that flashback, that is basically the number one thing I have wanted from this arc for over 10 years. So, I might be a little excited, we'll have to see. Anyway, that's it for episode 27, a fine return for the 1000 Year Blood War arc anime. Sure, the recap is a bit of a shame, but the actual new content we got was all stellar, to be honest. Uryū's new battle with Senjumaru, lasting from episode 25 through to now, is just excellent stuff. Her Bankai getting a chance to flourish is wonderful, and of course, it is critical for Uryū's character and the direction the anime is taking him, hammering home his conviction to the Wandenreich and their scheme. The finale of Ichibei vs Yhwach was also wonderful. The art direction for Futen Taisatsuryō was an excellent choice, creating something totally visually distinct and powerful feeling. And of course, the Almighty is here at last. One of the more controversial aspects of Bleach's final arc perhaps, but that just means I'm very excited to see how the anime depicts and handles it moving forwards. Yhwach's ascension to the palace was masterful and grandiose, and now I am ready to really dive into the Soul King for real. The question is, will the Soul King manage to appear on a thumbnail or not? Maybe. We'll have to wait and see. Alright guys, but that's it for this apparently extremely long, in-depth spoiler review and discussion of episode 27 of the 1000-Year Blood War arc anime titled A. Let me know in the comments below, what did you think of episode 27? Did you enjoy it? What do you think of the numerous new content, the new additions added to this episode? Uryū taking on and killing Senjumaru, Yhwach making his way up to the palace. I'd love to hear all of your thoughts down in the comments below. Did you like the episode? Was there anything you felt could have been done better or differently? And what predictions do you have for episode 28? Do please let me know all of your thoughts down in the comments below, and I appreciate you if you stuck around this long as well. But that's it from me, guys. As always, I want to end the video by saying a massive thank you and giving a huge shout out to my wonderful supporters over on Patreon, without whom I simply wouldn't be able to do this. If you like what I do here over on YouTube and you also want to support the channel as well, thank you. By supporting me at the $1 tier a month, you can get your name in the credits of every single video just like this, and at the $2 tier or higher, you can get every video I release absolutely free of baked-in YouTube ads. Alright guys, that's it from me. Thank you so very much for watching. Until next time, I'll catch you later, and I'll see you then.